I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast Supplement.
All right, Lee. When last we appeared, we were forging through the final dark waters of the Mao years.
Well, you were. I was in Taiwan.
Well, it's actually not true for both of us because I was talking about some really interesting stuff. It was just below ground.
Huan Chunming, nativist Taiwanese literature.
Mengke
you had
and
Mengke, yeah.
Actually, yeah. So anyway, there was great stuff.
Nothing to
happening
complain
towards the
about.
end.
That decade was, in terms of what was published, was quite on the mainland is quite bad. But that's to, we can't ignore the fact that
was
there
published
are places
above ground. Was bad.
There are places outside of mainland Chinese publication houses that actually produce great literature.
Incredible
in
stuff.
Chinese.
Yeah. But this week in our supplement. This is your call, and you've got us some clickbait. Tell the people what we're talking about this week.
Today we are going to finally answer the question you have all been asking: Is Taiwan Chinese?
That's the actual name of the book. Now,
oh, that's right. That's the name of the book too. Yeah,
we're gonna settle it though. I mean, if you're listening to this, when
Xi
you finish
Jinping,
this,
Tsai Ing-wen, Joe Biden, everybody is going to be listening
because when we're done. The question will be definitively settled by two dudes in Oregon. We're
drinking beer, drinking way too much beer.
Yeah, not enough really if we're talking about this particular question.
I think there's not enough beer in the world to really solve this question.
There's really not. Maybe enough baijiu. But when you first suggested this book, I resisted.
You were like, no.
No, I was like, no. And the reason is, well, yeah, a lot of you can probably identify. Because I thought, oh, great, another one of these books where it's like, let me tell you just how bad the mainland is and why Taiwan should be its own. I was like, I'm kind of tired of this thing. And then a little ways through, I was like, oh.
I for once convinced you.
Yeah, well, actually, you convinced me quite a bit. I just don't admit it on air because it's not a good precedent.
So today we're looking at Melissa Brown's Is Taiwan Chinese? It's an anthropological study from, I think, the late 90s, early 2000s. Ethnicity and kind of claims
Identity
of identity and Chineseness in not only Taiwan, but also there's a chapter in the book on China. So just briefly, let me sketch what the book is about. So the book discusses this argument, whether or not Taiwan is Chinese, and how those claims are made in differing ways on either side of the Taiwan Strait. And then she has two really fascinating chapters of just pure anthropological research on some villages south of Tainan, southwest of Tainan, in a very remote area, and some villages in Hubei, if I remember correctly. And what she does is she goes and looks at how these villages constructed identities related to Chineseness. So the villages in Taiwan are villages that 100 years ago were completely Aboriginal. They were from the Plains Aborigines is how that's oftentimes translated, that lived in Taiwan. And what happened is not that the people actually changed, but they didn't physically disappear. They just kind of converted to Chinese. If you can call it that. That's a weird way to say it. That almost makes it sound like a religion. This happened so seamlessly that, when she's doing her research in the 90s, a lot of the kids in the village, like teenagers and 20-somethings, 30-somethings, they didn't even know that their grandparents were all Aboriginals. She'll ask someone, hey, what happened to all of the Aborigines who used to live here? And this kid will answer like, hey, I don't know. They just kind of disappeared. We don't know where they went. They're all gone. We're all Han Chinese here. And then they'll kind of like call out, hey, grandma, what happened to all them, Aboriginals? And the grandma would go, what are you talking about? I'm Aboriginal.
Right? Exactly.
It's like the weirdest thing. And in China, she goes to Hubei and looks at how a similar kind of ethnic minority was constructed. So in Taiwan, these Aboriginals became, quote unquote, I'm using scare quotes here, Chinese. And in Hubei, they actually the state had a large role in kind of deciding what ethnic group they were. And it's kind of arbitrary. She points out that there's just this date, I think it's 1735. Anyone whose family was in this region before 1735, counts as Aboriginal. Anyone whose family came after 1735 counts as Han. So the campaign to decide whether or not these people were ethnic minorities, 少数民族, starts, I think, in the 1950s, 1960s. But because of the Cultural Revolution, anything having to do with nationality is completely untouchable at a certain point. So this campaign stops, and it doesn't reach some villages. And a lot of those villagers had all of their family histories destroyed. And so they were able to, after the Cultural Revolution and things kind of cooled down, they were able to claim ethnic identity status, even though they probably weren't, according to, if their family histories had been there, their family histories would have probably said they're Han Chinese. Again, the point of all of this is not to decide whether or not they are Chinese. There is no, it's not like a pregnancy test. There's not like a plus or a minus sign that you can just urinate on and know what identity. Rob, you're looking at me.
I was about to say that would make for a very different geopolitical situation if you just had lines of people taking P tests
honestly,
for their nationality.
that could be a really good Liu Cixin
I'd love
short
to see
story,
that. I'd love to
sci-fi
see that.
short story, right?
Absolutely. The nationality P test.
But anyway, identity is very much constructed, and it's manipulated by governments, and it's manipulated by a lot of different social factors.
And this is really the strength of the book, because in the title, what you're expecting is a standard approach to, you can pick a media outlet, any media outlet, you're going to find some version of this question. But Melissa Brown's point is, well, we're spending way too much time on what governments say about nationality, who the leaders say these people are. So you're Taiwanese, you're Chinese because this little strip of land here, going back to whenever, was always claimed by our government. So that's one way to settle the argument. What her book is really talking about is, okay, but what do these people say about themselves? And not just, when I say these people, I don't just mean Taiwanese, but Chinese also. This is the strength of that section on Hubei is, great, we talked about Taiwan, but what do Chinese minorities say about themselves? How do they construct this?
So you're absolutely right. There is kind of a discussion of what do these people say about their identity, and that's separate from how kind of identity is imposed by governments. But her point is also that a lot of this is kind of strange because at least the Taiwanese villagers in these formerly Aboriginal villages, they don't even know that they are Aboriginal or that they come from an Aboriginal background, and that they essentially had this identity. They were allowed to become Han Chinese. The long story is that in the Japanese colonized Taiwan in 1895, they put an end to foot binding, and that foot binding was the only significant thing separating Taiwanese Aboriginals from Han Chinese non-Aboriginal populations. And so after about 15 years of not allowing foot binding, women from Aboriginal groups started marrying back and forth. And so they just kind of mixed, and no one really knew that they were Aboriginal. Like that identity just it just disappeared because no one wanted it.
And even within the Chinese language, this is the other thing that's really interesting. And I'd read this before, so I wasn't a stranger to this argument, especially if you've studied anything that belongs sort of the Sinophone literature umbrella. The very term Chinese in Chinese is problematic, right? So you can say something like 中国人.
For the listener who doesn't read Chinese and doesn't know 中国人, how political is it?
It's a national citizenship. So all 56 Chinese minorities can call themselves 中国人. 中is middle or center. The guo character usually is nation, kingdom, country, some sort of polis. And, of course, the traditional definition of this is the center, the middle kingdom.
That's what all bad journalists use
exactly.
to translate 中国as.
And we do occasionally, too, when we need some clickbait. But
we're not above
that. We're cheap. We're cheap, too.
Speaking of which, we are on Patreon as well.
Yeah, we are. We're making so much money. I'm going to go buy my new Jaguar this afternoon. Now that the warm weather's coming in, I can set the top back.
Back to Melissa
Brown, which is not talking about Jaguars. So 中国人 is a national citizenship thing, right? Now, if you're in China, what you're equally likely to hear anyway is Hanzu, which is a people group, the Han Chinese. In fact, Chinese characters are usually classified as Hanzi, like the characters of the Han but that's an ethnic group, or historically was an ethnic group.
Well, it's a political group. The Han Dynasty was a dynasty that became an ethnic. It's become.
But I mean, historically, yes, it was. Yeah, you're right.
This is a part of this is just we're having trouble trying to explain this because it's incredibly complicated and it's something that can't be explained. It's a
and
hot
even
mess.
then, and there's another one that I don't even think I'd have to go back and look at it again. I don't think she even includes this, which is Zhonghua Ren.
Yes, I don't think she discusses.
Now that's an interesting one because if you're familiar with the Wolf Warrior films, the movie posters, I'd have to go back and get the exact Chinese characters, but it uses, instead of Zhonghua Ren, the tagline is, those who harm or do something bad to Chinese people, they must be pursued no matter how far, right?
And it's
Zhonghua Ren.
right?
Now that could be what? Anybody, right? Anyone claiming some sort of connection to this, right? So there's lots of ways to figure this. And so this is why when I hear the title, Is Taiwan Chinese, I put quotes around the term Chinese, just mentally, because what she's getting at is, all right, look, first of all, the question of is Taiwan a part of China is not the same question as is Taiwan Chinese, or are the people in Taiwan Chinese? Are the people in Taiwan Taiwanese? What do these things mean? And this is such an important question because we spend so much time talking about government policy, right? Whether or not arms should be sold to Taiwan and what that's going to do to Chinese-American relations, and next to no time talking about what do people in these two countries, how do they conceive of themselves?
And how are those identities created?
Exactly. And this is why the book is so valuable, and why this line of thought is so valuable.
So President Biden,
read this freaking book.
We know you're listening.
Yeah. He's a longtime listener of the show. We get regular emails from him. He asks us lots of China questions.
He's actually one of our.
He's one of our.
Patreon
He only
guys.
gives $1 a month. It's cheap. Anyway, come on, dude. You've got enough money for all kinds of stuff. You can at least.
He's spending it on Amtrak.
Yeah, right. Or on the stimulus checks. We didn't. I think this podcast should be qualified as an essential business. But anyway.
So as we're kind of wrapping up, I have two things to discuss. First off, strippers.
I like how you just connected strippers with the President of the United States. I mean, not connected directly with, but that was the segue. So I'm curious to see where this goes.
So there's this weird thing in Taiwan where strippers are often, their services are given as offerings at temples or funerals, something like that. So, like at a funeral, someone will just pay for a couple of strippers to go and strip at this person's
Which
funeral.
would make funerals a lot more interesting.
A lot more well attended, too.
Agreed.
Rob, I've actually already purchased stripping services for you.
That's going to be a long
funeral.
time from now. I hope that's still, happening.
You dying?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to die. My fame's going to keep me alive.
But so it's a weird thing. It's done in Taiwan. I can't really explain it other than to say
it's a thing.
It's a thing. Yeah, this is like a thing. Especially in rural Taiwan, men will buy other men strippers for their funerals or services at a temple or something like that. Now, what's interesting is that Melissa Brown makes the point that so these Aboriginal villages that she's done her research on in Taiwan still have a more matriarchal social structure.
Which, in a matriarchal social structure, you can imagine people not being super thrilled at having strippers at sacred events.
Yeah. Like women are able to kind of have a lot more power, and you can imagine that those women don't really appreciate men bringing strippers into the temple and offering their services. So she actually has a story or two about strippers coming into one of the local temples, and some of the women leaders who are also seers, they're
prophetesses sort of thing.
Yeah, prophets. They just go in and like shut off the electricity to the temple, and they're just like get out. So her point is, and this is how it relates to Taiwanese and Chinese identity. Although we do love to emphasize the word strippers in this. Her point is that in these villages that were matriarchal Aboriginal societies 100 years ago, you still can see outlines of the matriarchal society. So in a normal Taiwanese temple, you might be able, like it would be no problem to bring in strippers and their services as an offering to the temple. So that they're dancing but not in these villages. It's going to be a little bit harder. So that's her point.
And many of the people involved may not themselves be consciously saying, or the women involved may not be consciously saying, we're doing this because we are still proudly holding on to our matriarchal culture, etc.
Yeah,
it's just a
no
thing.
one knows. It's just like they have this matriarchal power that's still kind of operating.
Yeah. That's a really strange example, but it is interesting. And it also points out there's such an unconscious aspect to this question that maybe for obvious reasons no one really writes about. And the question of, is Taiwan Chinese? This is one of those levels that, well, kind of not, simply because, and not even on a level anyone can explain. It's just sometimes just a thing that's been passed down.
You just lost your visa
I
to
did.
China.
Of course, I wasn't trying to get there anyway, but hope I can go back someday.
The last thing I wanted to point out, her answer to the question, is Taiwan Chinese, this is a stupid question.
Which is such a great answer.
She doesn't really, I'm kind of summarizing a bit, but she makes the point that if the PRC were to bring its kind of categorization of ethnic minorities from Hubei to Taiwan, the answer would be no. Taiwan is not Chinese. But both answers are these Xiaoshu Minzu in Hubei, and are these people in Taiwan Chinese? How do they qualify? What is their identity? Both of the answers are not driven by data or facts. They're driven more by politics and the needs of governments on both sides. Everybody's guilty. And that's what I think makes this book so fascinating.
I would agree. As always, well, not as always. As we wrap this up, though, as always, everybody, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, ChinLitPod on Twitter, ChineseLitPod on Instagram.
Rob, you're trying to be good about tweeting.
Yeah. Twitter's not really our thing, but we do try to put stuff on there so people know we exist. But there's another way people can support the efforts of the Chinese Literature Podcast, and that is through Patreon, Chinese Literature Podcast.
So if you were thinking of making an offering of strippers to a Taiwanese temple, but you want to look for a slightly better cause, maybe it's the Chinese Lit Podcast.
Bearing in mind that this probably will get shut down by the more matriarchally powerful members of our family.
I can just see one of the prophetesses going into Patreon's like
negative
offices and just shutting the power down.
I can see that happening as well. It's a thought that counts.
Well, I think that's a great place to end it. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.